Today, September 13th, is the 30th anniversary of Mortal Monday, the home console release of the original Mortal Kombat on 4 different platforms. This was an important milestone in console gaming, and it's worth a look back. So why was the original Mortal Kombat such a big deal? Well, it had a few different angles going for it. First, it used digitized actors for the character sprites. Now, this may not seem remarkable these days, but back in '92, when Mortal Kombat first hit the arcades, this was a big deal. It wasn't the first game to do this, but it was the first that didn't, frankly, completely suck. The resolution, color depth, and good animation frames helped the characters come alive in ways that hadn't really been possible before, and the plot about a mysterious bad guy hosting a secret martial arts tournament played on the popularity of movies like Bloodsport and Enter the Dragon. Second, the simplicity. Most popular fighting games at the time, like the groundbreaking Street Fighter II, had characters with completely different movesets, a variety of combo tactics, complicated controls, and sometimes even stage hazards. Well, Mortal Kombat was different. You could play this almost as a pure button masher with at least some level of success, and all of the characters had the same basic moveset, with only special attacks differentiating them. The learning curve to go from a total noob to a basic level of competence was pretty low, and it was a lot easier for a new player to get into Mortal Kombat than it was for most other early 90s arcade fighters. Now that said, the difficulty in single player ramped up pretty hard after the first few fights, and there was still a huge skill gap in between an average player and some of the top-tier arcade hustlers. The two-player experience in the arcades was also a lot more competitive than other games at the time, again since it was so easy to get into, but still challenging to truly master. Third, the violence. Again, it may seem relatively tame by modern standards, but back in the day, this was an extreme level of blood and gore for a video game. Up to this point, fighting games focused on cartoony graphics, character knockouts, and very limited actual injuries. Then, along came Mortal Kombat. The fighters were leaking gallons of blood with semi-realistic looking violence, and it was possible to use finishing moves to actually kill your opponents. This was like moving up from a PG-rated movie to an R rating, and it was a huge shock at the time. So much so that it prompted the US Senate to hold hearings on video game violence, and they even filed legislation that was only dropped after the formation of the ESRB in 1994. That's right, Mortal Kombat was so badass that the US Senate got involved and threatened to shut it down. To a guy in the 90s, that was a level of street cred that no marketing budget could have bought. Street Fighter II may have had more characters, vivid colors, and a little bit more variety, but Mortal Kombat was hard fucking core. It's also worth mentioning that Mortal Kombat was a pretty big commercial success. During most of 1993, it was one of the top 2 or 3 highest grossing arcade games, selling about 24,000 cabinets overall and making hundreds of millions of dollars for Midway and arcade operators. The decision to get home console ports rolling was obvious, and Acclaim scooped up the rights. During the summer of 1993, the dark ages before the internet was really much of a thing, magazines and TVs were flooded with ads to make sure everyone knew Mortal Kombat was coming home on September 13th, Mortal Monday. Aw yeah. So the day finally came, and I'm old enough to remember it pretty well. Tons of people stood in line to get their console copy of Mortal Kombat. It really was one of the first truly big, hyped-up console releases. And once people got it home, reactions were pretty mixed. There were 4 versions, one each for the Sega Genesis, Sega Gamegear, Super NES, and Game Boy, each with its own set of quirks and compromises. You have to remember that during the early 90s, arcade-perfect ports to home consoles or home computers were very rare. It was expected and considered normal, with very few exceptions, for home versions of arcade games to have inferior graphics and sound, and even some content removed. Mortal Kombat was no different. There was a perception that arcade cabinets had a few $1,000s of computer hardware in them, while your home console cost $150. Now, there were still times where players kind of felt let down, like the disastrous Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man. But with Mortal Kombat, we all knew there would be compromises, but we had no idea how good or bad it would actually be once we all got it home. So let's take a look at the ports. First up is the Sega Genesis. This version has some issues, and it was actually the first home version I played myself back in the day. The graphics are a pretty significant downgrade from the arcade cabinet, which was inevitable due to, limitations of the graphics hardware, and the voice samples are a bit garbled. That said, the music still sounded great, and the gameplay was pretty solid. The controls were snappy with no input processing delays, and the overall mechanics felt like a pretty good match to the arcade. The blood was removed, but it could be added back in easily through a cheat code that was printed in basically every gaming magazine on the planet. The real killer, though, was the 3-button controller. It was a bit awkward and sacrificed one of the attack buttons and lost a pause function since the start button was mapped to block. If you wanted to have a good time, you really needed the 6-button controller, which very few people had at the time, since it was very new and pretty expensive. In fact, I never even saw a 6-button Genesis controller in person until many years later. The 3-button problem was actually a pretty common issue in Genesis ports of arcade games, and Mortal Kombat wasn't spared. Overall, though, the Genesis version was the best-selling of the home console ports, and despite its issues, still provided a pretty faithful arcade experience, with the blood code turned on anyway. The Super Nintendo port had, by far, the best graphics of all the home console versions. It also had better fidelity voiceover effects, but there were still some issues. First and most glaringly, the blood and half the fatalities were completely removed. This was Nintendo's censorship at work, and all of the game's blood effects were changed into a grayish-brownish color. And I remember the debates from the time if it was supposed to be sweat or puke, but either way, it wasn't blood. And combined with the removal of 4 out of the 7 fatalities, this was an enormous letdown for a lot of players. You can use a Game Genie code, which I'll totally show on the screen right now, to palette swap the sweat puke to red, to kind of make it look like blood again, but the missing fatalities are gone forever, and even with the Game Genie code, it's just not the same. The second big problem was the controls. Now, the Super NES had a full 6-button controller, so nothing was lost in terms of functionality. But the game suffers from some weird input behavior that's kind of hard to describe beyond just saying that it has sloppy controls. The timing of button presses sometimes seems like it's off by like half a second, which makes special moves noticeably more difficult to pull off, and it can screw up the timing on attack combos. Plus, the Test Your Might bonus breaking minigame was way more difficult on the Super NES because of this weird input issue. The poor controls really were a thing, and we absolutely noticed it back in the day, to the point where one guy I knew thought that his console and controller were busted or something, and had one of our buddies bring his controller over to try. This was the best looking and best sounding home version released on Mortal Monday, like no question, but the actual gameplay experience just wasn't as good as the Genesis, and with most of the blood and gore removed, it just didn't feel like Mortal Kombat, and it sold very poorly. Nintendo learned from all this, and when Mortal Kombat 2 finally came out for the Super NES, all the blood and fatalities were back in to stay. We also got Mortal Kombat on portable consoles. The Gamegear version, which is what we're looking at here, made some really heavy compromises and has a lot of issues. Like the Genesis version, you need to use a blood code if you want to get the full experience, and they removed both Kano and Reptile from the game due to memory limitations. Some animation frames were cut, the voiceover samples are gone, and the graphics were dramatically scaled back to fit the Game Gear's screen. This kind of made the arenas feel a lot smaller and zoomed in, which made it much more difficult to position for some of the special moves, and leg sweeps could sometimes hit from halfway across the screen. Plus, only 2 buttons, so they had to condense both punches and both kicks onto one punch button and one kick button, and then you had to use D-pad inputs with the attack buttons to differentiate a crouching kick and a leg sweep, for example. So, it was a compromise, but not the worst way to handle it, and it actually felt pretty natural after you got used to it, maybe after like 20 minutes or so. Also, the soundtrack was swapped out, and the game's music definitely had that unique low-fidelity Game Gear sound to it. The news wasn't all bad though. The game still actually plays pretty well, and the slowdown wasn't as obnoxious as you might think after playing for a few minutes. The hit detection is reasonably good, and the controls are actually very snappy, possibly the most responsive of any of the original 4 home ports. Now by this point though, most Game Gear owners had at least one game like Sonic the Hedgehog or Streets of Rage, so they generally had very realistic expectations of what a game like Mortal Kombat was going to be like after it was translated down to the Game Gear. Many other Game Gear ports were butchered really bad, but Mortal Kombat actually came out pretty decent considering the limitations, and this was the only version I never heard anyone complain about back in the day. It wasn't great, but it was exactly what people expected it to be. Lastly, the Game Boy port. It's almost unplayable. Most of the footage you see of it nowadays comes from emulators with video filters and stuff, but this mess is what it actually looked like back in the day, except it was only 2 inches wide with no backlighting, and there was significant pixel ghosting on the original LCD. The sound was unusually bad, it runs quite slow, the hit detection is flaky, and both Johnny Cage and Reptile were cut. The real fatality, though, is the controls. There's a noticeable level of button input lag that makes special moves almost impossible to perform. In capturing footage for this video, Sub-Zero's Freeze Ball was the only special move from any character that I was able to get working intentionally, and even then, only about half of the time. Also, again, only 2 buttons, so that was another issue, and like the Game Gear, the moves needed D-pad input in addition to the attack buttons to work, but because of the weird delay, a lot of times you didn't get what you were looking for. Now, the lagging controls are also pretty clunky, and honestly, most traditional Mortal Kombat combos and tactics just don't work. Like, at all. And the only reliable way to consistently win matches on the Game Boy is just to cheese out with jump kicks and leg sweeps. On the upside, this version has a genuine secret. If you beat the game and input a code on the end screen, you can actually play as Goro, the only Mortal Monday release where Goro was a playable character without a Game Genie or something. Of course, to unlock him, you had to beat the Game Boy port. But even with Goro as an unlockable character, the Game Boy release was generally considered the worst of the Mortal Monday home ports, and even the people who had it were generally pretty honest that it sucked really bad. Now, with the 4 releases covered, I want to share a little personal retrospective. I was a teenager back when Mortal Monday hit, and Mortal Kombat was a big deal in my various friend circles. For me personally though, I generally preferred Street Fighter II, but since the Super NES version of Street Fighter II was so amazingly well done and had been out for over a year, most of my Street Fighter fix was on home consoles over at buddies' houses. Whenever I had the chance to hit an arcade, Mortal Kombat was always the first stop, and there was almost always a crowd. Even one of the local pizza places had managed to pick up a Mortal Kombat cabinet, and it certainly worked at getting people in the front door. Even though it was pay per play, there was just something unique about the two-player experience of Mortal Kombat 1 on an arcade cabinet. To me, the inclusion of the dedicated block button, as opposed to holding backwards like in Street Fighter and most other similar games, was actually pretty awkward, and honestly, to this day, I've never really gotten used to it, even though I still love the original Mortal Kombat trilogy. With the home versions, the only one of the 4 consoles I owned at the time was a Game Boy, and I knew well that a game like Mortal Kombat was just going to be awful, so I didn't pick it up myself. But lots of my buddies got one of the various home ports. As I mentioned near the beginning of the video, reactions were pretty mixed, but still generally positive. And almost every weekend for several months, at least one of my buddies hosted a Mortal Kombat tournament on one console or another. My own interest in the home scene for Mortal Kombat 1 started to wane off pretty quickly though, as right around this time, we got the first rumors and hushed whispers of a sequel coming to the arcades in the immediate future. And little did we know at the time how epic that was going to turn out to be. But that's a story for another time. As always, thanks for watching.